All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our Stavros Niarchos Foundation Brain Insight Lecture. I'm Dr. Dinah Lee. I'm the Associate Director for Education and Training Initiatives here at the Zuckerman Institute. And I'm really excited that you're all here, both in person and tuning in online, for this marvelous lecture series. So the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Brain Insight Lecture Series offers lectures featuring world-class scientists and experts addressing issues of societal importance to inform and engage our community. And we're going to be showcasing some fascinating real-life applications of neuroscience research and also technology tonight. So in continuing our commitment to outstanding science and excellent programming, we hope that tonight's lecture will leave you with a better understanding of the science happening in New York City at the Zuckerman Institute, at Columbia University, and at Barnard College. And in conjunction with this lecture series, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Teacher Scholar Program supports local science teachers who bring this content from these lectures into their classrooms. And we are really thrilled to continue welcoming our teacher scholars back in person to this lecture series. And I'm so happy to know that so many of you are tuning in online. And I would particularly love to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation and the foundation members who join us here tonight for their continued partnership and commitment to helping make brain science accessible for all. So tonight's topic is all about vision. I was having a vision about today's talk, so thank you, the chuckles in the room for that. So and the topic is really fascinating in my opinion because it's not just how we see the physical world, but how we can learn from it to inform our behaviors, decisions, and choices. So you'll be treated to presentations from two really incredible speakers, followed by a conversation which will be led by Barnard College's Dr. Vasiki Chauhan. So Dr. Chauhan is a neuroscientist and postdoctoral fellow whose research sits at the intersection of perception and cognition. So she explores how the human brain responds to and perceives highly specific visual categories that are all over our environment. Her PhD research at Dartmouth College, under the guidance of Dr. James Haxby and Dr. Maria Ida Golbini, focused on the perception of familiar faces, in particular how socially relevant stimuli enhance detection and recognition performance. She's now at the Barnard Vision Lab, mentored by Dr. Alex White, and she's studying brain responses in the visual word form area to visual presentation of word-like stimuli. So she's trying to figure out whether a person needs to be performing a linguistic task for this region to be engaged, or if the mere presence of word-like character strings is sufficient to elicit those responses. In addition to research, Dr. Chauhan greatly values teaching and mentorship, and she spends time on projects that make science more inclusive and accessible for all. And she currently serves as the publisher for the print magazine Science for the People. Before I turn it over to Dr. Chauhan to introduce tonight's speakers, I want to thank those of you who already submitted questions in advance, because what makes our lectures so exciting and dynamic and special is when we can address your questions. So during the Q&A, Dr. Chauhan will alternate between questions submitted online and those asked in person. So if you're watching online, don't forget to use that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions as you listen to tonight's really amazing talks. And for our in-person attendees, during that Q&A portion, just raise your hand and you'll be able to ask your question by speaking into this microphone. So please give me a very warm welcome to our host and moderator, Dr. Vasiki Chauhan.
Thank you, Diana, for that lovely introduction. I'm really excited to be a part of this incredible series. And it's really my pleasure to introduce this event to all of you here today. Today's event, we'll be hearing about research from Dr. Rudy Behnia and Dr. Shuran Song, two experts who study vision from distinct but complementary perspectives. Our speakers will discuss how agents spanning from animals to robots use vision to not only sense their environment, but to learn from it as well. We've learned so much about the mammalian brain by studying vision. Our very understanding of neural computation relies heavily on how light in the external world is transformed into electrical impulses in the brain. I'm particularly excited about the discussion today as it cuts across so many different ways in which agents use their ability to see in order to navigate the environment. My own research, as Diana very graciously explained, pertains to a visual ability that is remarkably recent in our evolutionary history as a species, which is the ability to read. Our brains change reliably as we learn to read, which to me is a strong indication that our neural resources can be flexibly leveraged to represent what we deem as important in our visual world. I can't wait to learn more about what is seen as important visual information by the model organisms and agents studied by the speakers today, and to reflect on the similarities and the differences in the abilities they develop to access this information. Now, to talk a little bit about how this event is going to go, we'll hear two 15-minute talks, one from each speaker, after which I will moderate a discussion in which we will include questions from you, our audience, in person as well as online. If you've already submitted a question, thank you so much for doing that. If you wish to submit a question while the talks are in progress, which is a great time to do so, please look for the Q&A button to submit your questions to the panelists. They'll be eyeing the questions coming in throughout. And please let us know if you're particularly a teacher or a student. And if you're a student, tell us what grade you're in. And thank you for being here. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Rudy Behnia, who's a neuroscientist studying how the brain processes the dynamic information coming in from our surrounding environment. Using sophisticated yet compact brains of fruit flies as a model, she will bring us into the world of animal behavior and discuss the neuroscience behind color perception. Dr. Behnia is an assistant professor of neuroscience and principal investigator at Columbia University's Zuckerman Institute. She received her PhD in molecular and cell biology from Cambridge University in the UK, working on membrane trafficking in the Laboratory of Molecular Biology with Dr. Sean Monroe. In her postdoctoral work at New York University in the lab of Dr. Claude Desplan, Dr. Behnia investigated the neuronal circuits responsible for processing information about the direction of observed motion in the brain of the fruit fly. At Columbia University, Dr. Behnia's laboratory addresses central issues in the relationship between sensation and behavior, aiming to answer questions such as how are basic features such as color computed and formatted to guide behavior? How do behavior and internal or environmental states tune sensory perception to best serve the organism? Using the powerful genetic tools available in the fruit fly, combined with the state-of-the-art experimental approaches and computational modeling, work in her lab aims to extract fundamental principles about how the brain builds flexible, behaviorally relevant representations of the physical world. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Behnia to the stage.
Hello. Thank you so much, Vasiki, for this really nice introduction. And thank you all for being here. I would like to give a very special thank you to the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, thanks to who we're here this evening. So let's talk about vision. Let me find this. So we are, as humans, very visual beings. We use our sense of vision to understand the world around us, to learn and to make decisions. But we're not the only ones who use vision, of course. Many animals use vision to drive their behaviors. And I wanted to start with this slide showing kind of the diversity of vision that really exists in the animal kingdom. And all of these eyes are beautiful to me. They're also a little weird here and there. But they're the way they are for a reason. They were shaped by evolution to best serve the animals in question. I think it's really fascinating to learn about vision in different animals. And so some of the things that are different between different animals are, for instance, sorry, put down, I'm pushing down. Hector, sorry. Is it clicked in or? Is Hector there? Sorry about that. We will get this working. Yeah, at least it's nice to look at. This one is a mantis shrimp. Okay, there you go. We can start again. Okay, so going back to the diversity, I just want to take you through a few examples of what this diversity can look like. There you go. So one of the things that varies between animals, for example, is the extent of binocular vision. It turns out that there are very clear differences between prey and predator. If you consider a prey such as this pigeon, they have eyes that are often on each side of their heads. And this really extends the field of view of this animal to almost 360 degrees. And this is very helpful when you are trying to escape a predator that might come from behind you, right? In contrast, if you are a predator, often your eyes are going to be in front of your eyes, just like us. And that expands the binocular vision, basically. And this binocular vision is very important for depth perception. And if you're a predator, you want to be able to see depth so that you can go and hunt these animals that are moving away and towards you, right? Some animals also see things that we do not see. It's not working again. I'm so sorry. We can't see it exactly. There you go. So some animals see things that we do not see. This is, I want to take the example of monarch butterflies who have this ability to sense polarized light. And they use this information for their very famous migration because it tells them where the sun is in the sky. And they do this, they can detect a polarized light with very specialized photoreceptors in the top of their eyes, which we obviously don't have because we don't use this for our behaviors. This is just not working. Okay. Bees also see things that we do not see. They see ultraviolet light, so very short wavelength light. And this is really helpful because it reveals patterns in flowers that really help them find nectar. And the way that they can do this is because one of the photoreceptors in their eyes is actually sensitive to ultraviolet light here. Yes, and so there is actually a large diversity in the number and the sensitivity of photoreceptors across the animal kingdom. We also have 3 photoreceptors in our eyes, but they're tuned and they're shifted to slightly longer wavelengths, which are blue, red, and green. Blue, green, and red. Most mammals on Earth actually are dichromats. They only have 2 photoreceptor types, such as mice or dogs, for example. And there are animals that have more than 3, such as birds and some fish. And so this really tells you about the diversity of eyes. And I've only talked to you about eyes so far. But when it comes to vision, eyes are windows into the world. But what really is doing the hard work is our brain. And so what I mean by that is that it's not because an animal has binocular vision that it necessarily has depth perception. It's not because an animal can sense polarized light that it can actually build a cognitive map of the sky. And it's not because an animal has different photoreceptor types that it actually has color vision. And so really, if there's one thing that you need to remember from my talk, it's really that perception, vision and perception as a whole is really a construct of our brain. And so to dig a little bit deeper into this idea of a perception as kind of seen through the lens of the perceptual brain, I'm going to tell you about color vision today. So this is what my lab works on, but it's also a really great example, I think, of the differences between what a physical aspects of the world are and our perceptual experience of it. They're really not the same thing. Okay, so I think one of the best examples of this difference between perceptual experience and physical world is the color purple. So this is the very small part of the electromagnetic spectrum that humans can see. You can see, in the world, there are violet photons, blue photons, green photons, orange photons, red ones, but there are no purple photons. There's no physical entity that is a purple photon. We see purple, we sense purple only when an object reflects both red and blue photons. So purple is really a construct that happens in our brain and is nowhere else, really. So I think it's a really nice example of this. But so how does the brain construct the percept of purple? Or in general, how does the brain basically construct all of the hues that we can see in the world? And so this is the question that my lab is trying to answer. Okay, so as I said, the brain is what is doing everything. But so what do we know about color vision? So most of what we know about color vision has come from studies that were done in primates, trichromatic primates. And we know that vision starts there. And there are 3 photoreceptor types that act as filters for incoming light. And each one of these different photoreceptors is basically a different, acts as kind of a channel through which light comes into the brain. And each of these different channels are basically separated. And what the eye does is that it separates light into these different discrete channels. And each of these channels taken on its own is basically colorblind. It only sees in grayscale. The identity of the photons that went into this filter is completely lost. So how does the brain then use this deconstructed information to reconstruct the thousands of hues that we can see? That's kind of the fundamental and fascinating problem that we want to tackle in my lab. And so the trick is that even though each one of these channels on its own doesn't have the information necessary, together they have the information that the brain needs to actually reconstruct all of these different hues. And it is the relative activation of these different channels that matters. And so what the brain needs to do is to compare the activation of each of these different channels. And it does this using very special neurons called color opponent cells. And these color opponent cells basically are linear integration of photoreceptor inputs, and they're activated by a specific range of wavelengths and inhibited by a different range of wavelengths. Deeper in the brain, we think it is thought that these opponent signals are combined in a way that we absolutely do not understand yet, to give rise to signals that are actually now related to perception and that correspond to hues that we see. So these neurons have very tight tuning towards different parts of the spectrum. They might respond to teal, but not to blue and not to green. And they are thought to be really the locus or one of the loci of our color perception. And so the question now is, how it's really fascinating, I think, that the brain can kind of use this process of deconstruction, reformatting, and reconstruction to give us access to all these different hues that we experience. But how does the brain do this? It's a really hard question to ask in the really complicated brain of mammals, of primates and humans. And I want to really get at circuit mechanisms. And to do this, I use a different animal because what has turned out, kind of in the last few decades, we've realized that the motifs that are used in human brains are also used in other animals to at a kind of very high level. And so I work on fruit flies, as Vasiki mentioned. So fruit flies have a very special place in biological discoveries. They're a very prominent model now for neuroscience. They have 4 different photoreceptors in their eyes. They actually see UV, just like bees. They have 2 UV photoreceptors, and they see in the blue and green, and they don't see in the red much. But it's not because they see differently from us that we can't learn from them. They're really amazing models because they have very compact brains, very few cells that are really tractable. They grow fast, they're very cheap, which is also really nice. And they have this amazing toolkit of genetic tools that we can use to do really cool experiments. And very recently, there's been one addition to this amazing toolkit that we already have, and that is the whole brain connectome. So what we have access to now is basically a catalog of all of the neurons in the fly brain. We know their shape, their anatomy, who they connect to, who they talk to, how loud they talk to different cells. And this has been really transformative in our field. And it really guides a lot of the experiments that we do in our lab. So we use this connectome to basically trace, kind of follow light as it goes from photoreceptor to specific nerve cells in the brain. And once we find these cells, what we do is that we use these some new microscopy techniques combined with genetic tools to go and measure the activity of specific neurons in live flies as they're like dangling here from this preparation holder, as we show them different wavelengths of light in this case. And so this is one example of kind of a real recording. This is the raw data, this is the processed data, and each of these different blobs that you see is a single cell. And these are the traces that correspond to each one of them in response to different lights. And so through experiments like this, we can really start to understand how the brain can process visual information and chromatic information in particular. Okay, so I'm going to take you through some of the data from my lab, some recent data from my lab. And so, as I said, we used the connectome to trace these chromatic pathways. And the first thing that we did is to test our methods by looking at the responses of the light sensing part of these photoreceptors themselves. We think we know what they should respond to, but now we want to go and measure them in vivo. And so that's what we started doing. And these are responses of these 4 different types of photoreceptors. The dashed line is the prediction, and the colored line are actual measurements. And as you can see, they match well. So we're very happy to know that our methods actually work. So then we wanted to go deep and follow light as it goes through, or this information as it goes through. And the next step, we looked kind of downstream of this, and we looked at the terminals of these photoreceptors themselves. And what we found, and we're really amazed to find, is that these photoreceptor terminals are color opponent. They depolarize to a range of wavelengths and hyperpolarize to a different range. So they're basically the equivalent of the color opponent neurons that we have in our brains that compare light from different parts of the spectrum. What we can do in flies is also go and look at circuit mechanisms underlying these responses. And we find, again, that there's a circuit downstream that is, again, very similar to what happens in our brains, using horizontal cells to connect photoreceptors that are next to each other. So once we had this, then we wanted to ask kind of the big question of how are these color opponent signals further processed? Can we find hue cells in flies as we find in human brains? So what we did was to follow again the connectome, and we focused on 3 neurons called TM cells, and we measured their responses. And what we found is that these neurons have very narrow, exquisitely narrow tuning in color space. This one responds to violet light, TM5A responds to UV light, and TM20 responds mostly to blue light. And in addition, TM5A and TM520 respond even better to combinations of non-spectral colors, just like our purple, basically. And using mathematical modeling, we were able to show that these neurons are basically the equivalent of the hue neurons that we have in our brains, because they start to now encode, rather than encoding the physical aspects of light, they really encode our perceptual experience, or the perceptual experience of flies to colors, to hues. And so what can we do now? We can use all the genetic tools that are available in flies to go and dissect the circuit mechanisms that give rise to these perceptual signals. And this is the slightly more complicated version of this circuit that we're going and basically one by one silencing or activating and understanding, trying to understand what the role of each of these different connections is to kind of get an understanding of how these hue cells are constructed in the brain. And so before I end, I just want to go back to my first slide, because I think it's important. One of the really important things that I would like to convey is the fact that we can really take advantage of this diversity in vision and learn more about vision than if we just study humans or just study trichromatic primates. I think to really understand fundamental principles of vision, we need to do comparative studies that really tell us how and why circuits are formed the way that they are. And so with this, I would like to end by thanking my lab. They're the ones that do all the work, and also thanking you for your attention.
Thank you so much for that lovely talk, Rudy. It's really a great example in how convergent evolutionary solutions emerge in nature to solve the same tasks that the brain is posed with. I can't wait for the discussion after watching that talk. Thank you so much. I'd like to remind you that if you have a question at this moment, please use the Q&A button, and we'll try to answer them in the Q&A after the second talk. Moving right on, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Sharan Sung, who's a computer scientist building computer vision algorithms at the forefront of robotics that enable machines to see better. Drawing from examples in her lab, she will discuss how robots can sense and perceive more than ever before by actively exploring the physical world and learning from these interactions to carry out complex tasks. Dr. Sung is an assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science at Columbia University. Before that, she received her PhD in computer science at Princeton University and her Bachelor of Engineering at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Her research interests lie at the intersection of computer vision and robotics. Dr. Sung's research has been recognized through several awards, including the Best Paper Award at the 2022 Robotics, Science and Systems and the 2020 Transactions on Robotics conferences, Best System Paper Awards at the 2021 Conference on Robot Learning and 2019 Robotics, Science and Systems Conference, and as a finalist at Robotics, Science and Systems Conference, the International Conference on Robotics and Automation, Computer Vision and Pattern Recognition Conference, and International Conference on Intelligent Robots and Systems. She is a recipient of the NSF Career Award, as well as research awards from Microsoft, Toyota Research, Google, Amazon, JP Morgan, and Sloan Foundation. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Sung to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the nice introduction, and thank you so much for everyone coming tonight. Yeah, so this talk, we are still gonna continue our journey on perception, but now we're gonna focus on a slightly different species, which is robots, right? So we also, oftentimes we call robotics as embodied artificial intelligence, right? So what makes embodied AI different from just a general AI is the fact that they just like as humans and animals, they have a physical body, allows them to physically interact with this environment. And as you'll soon see in this talk, this embodiment really make all the difference when we are designing their perception algorithms. Great. Okay. So yeah, so the overarching goal in our lab is trying to develop algorithms that enables robots to see and understand their surrounding environment in a way that they can safely interact with the environment. Right. So here are just a lot of different robots that we built over the years, and including the ones that kind of doing your laundry, or like the ones that tossing different objects into boxes, or the blower robot that's kind of just, we're trying to make them help you to clean up your floors. Right. So although all these different robots, they look very different in terms of their hardwares, they oftentimes actually share a very similar high-level structures when we build them, right? So oftentimes those systems will typically start with some kind of sensory inputs that try to record the physical world in the form of images or videos. And then we will try to develop computer vision algorithms that try to convert those raw sensory inputs into some kind of meaningful high-level representations of the environment. And hopefully those kind of representation can be directly used by the robots so that they can plan their action, such as grasping the coffee cup or moving around your home. And the process of trying to extract information from the raw sensory inputs, we oftentimes call them perception. And then if it's done by a computer, then we can call it computer vision, right? So that's the keyword, computer vision. And then over the past decades, we actually see a lot of progress in computer vision or in this field in general. And I think that personally, I feel the biggest tool driving force for all this development can be contribute to machine learning and big data or internet scale data. Right? So basically, the high-level idea is that we can show robots or machines a lot of images and then just kind of let them automatically learn different concepts of different objects. Right? So basically showing the robots thousands of cat photos so that they can recognize what is a cat. So all those computer vision algorithms, they're actually quite powerful, and you already can see a lot of applications, like for example, embedded in your phones or Instagrams. But they do make one fundamental assumption that's also their core limitation, which is that they kind of making this passive observer assumption, which means that the machine learning algorithm kind of just sit there and look at images or videos, really without ability to actively interact with the physical world. Right? So in other words, we kind of just training our robots, kind of like couch potato robots that sit there and watching movies. But really, I think this inability of interacting with the world kind of limits their deeper understanding about the physical world. And that's what we're trying to address in our research. Right? So actually, I think on the other hand, as humans or animals, our interaction with the physical world actually is very critical, will play a very critical role in our perception system. And in fact, we are really good at using our own action in order to retrieve useful information about the environment. And here are just a few simple, sorry. Okay, so here are some simple examples, right? So oftentimes, we can just dip our toes into the swimming pool just to sense its temperature before jumping into it. Or kind of push a box around in order to sense its weight before lifting it up. Or similarly, flipping a book just to see what's the title of the book before reading it. Right? So here in all these examples, we use different actions like dipping, pushing, and flipping in order to retrieve information about the environment, such as the temperature of the pool or the weight of the box. And then all those information actually can eventually be used for our action planning in the future, like whether we want to swim in that pool. Right, so the question here is, can we make our robot to share a similar capability, right? Use their ability to interact with the world to help them see better. So that is the main topic for my today's talk, which is interactive perception. Right, so the plan for today's talk is that I'm going to keep very high level, kind of just using a few of our recent projects to demonstrate the idea of interactive perception, and most importantly, highlight the advantage of interactive perception compared to classical passive vision paradigm. So first, I think also the most obvious advantage of interactive perception is that by using action, the agent now have the ability to get additional observations about the environment. Right? So for example, if you don't try to actively open up the drawer, you are never able to see inside. Right? There are certain information that's really hard to observe passively. And another good examples of this advantage is when we're dealing with deformable objects like clothes or garments, right? Seeing a clothes kind of like this kind of crumpled clothes lying on the floor is actually really hard to recognize what is this clothing item because of the problem of self-occlusion. But instead, what we can do is we can ask the robot to actively pick up this cloth and then try to recognize it after it pick up, right? So we can leverage the gravity force to help the robot to reveal more surface area on this cloth so that it's better or easier to recognize. And also at the same time, this simple pickup action is actually very easy to implement, and it can always success, and it doesn't really require much prior knowledge about this cloth. So with the help of such simple interactions, we are able to develop a perception algorithm that can infer and also reconstruct the 3D geometry of unknown garment or anything or any kind of garment that the robot have not seen before. And then apart from just helps the system to increase the visibility of a particular object, active interaction also can help the system to help them to discover those physical properties about objects that goes beyond their visual appearance. So for example, we know that for many of objects' physical properties, like their mass and friction, cannot be directly inferred from their visual appearance. Right? So for example, here we have 3 different metals. They have very different density, but their appearance looks very similar. So without really interacting with them, you don't really know what they're made of. And then to kind of try to help the robot to learn about objects' physical property, we developed a system called dense FitzNet, where the idea is to let the robot to kind of play with different objects and then also try to predict what's the object's motion after under different interactions. So our hypothesis here is that in order to accurately predict the object's motion into the future, the system kind of need to implicitly acquire understanding about objects' physical properties and how they will influence objects' motion. So here is actually the system in action that we let the robot to play with 3 different objects made with 3 different materials. And then here we're trying to show the feature embeddings of all the objects. So here each of the points corresponding to 1 pixel, and the color is indicate different object instances. So you can see that initially all these feature embeddings, they cannot really be separated on the embedding space, means that the system cannot really distinguish between these 3 different objects. However, while the system is interacting with these 3 blocks, you can see the embeddings, the feature embeddings start to become more and more separated in the embedding space, which indicates that the system or the model start to acquire a knowledge about object's physical property. And so here the robot actually used 2 types of actions to do the interaction. One is sliding the object, the other is creating a collision with another object. So those interactions is actually very critical to review object physical properties. And then in the end, we can actually train a linear classifier on top of those learned features in order to explicitly decode those physical properties like their friction and mass. And in our experiment, actually one interesting thing that we found is that it is actually quite important for the robot to kind of make use of different type of actions in order to learn better about the physical properties, right? So for example, we can always get better results when the robot uses both collision and sliding compared to only using 1 type of actions. So a natural question to ask here when seeing these results is how about adding more actions? Like what if we can let the robot to have different type of interactions where they are able to allow them to learn a better or richer object representation? So to answer that question, we actually looked into a very special type of interaction or action type that is tossing. So here you are looking at a robot that's called tossing bot that learns how to throw different, quite arbitrary objects precisely into the target box, which is labeled in green. So I think it is pretty cool to look at the robot that's able to toss objects, actually toss object better than me. But I think the underlying scientific question that we really want to answer is, what kind of object information can the system acquire in the process of learning how to throw? So just to get to the conclusion, actually what we found is that in order to learn how to toss different objects, the system first needs to understand the object's mass distribution. Right? So for example, for this screwdriver, if the robot actually grasps around the center of mass and toss the object, it will actually land much closer compared to if it grasps on the tip of the object. Right? So that's the grasping location with respect to the center of mass. And also, in addition to that, the system also needs to kind of understand object's aerodynamics, right? So, for example, this ping pong ball will actually land much closer due to air resistance. So, what that shows is that the system actually, like tossing ball, is able to kind of learn objects, like a pretty rich object representation that encodes their physical properties, like their mass and air distribution, mass distribution and aerodynamics, by just learning how to throw. And it's able to learn all these different concepts without a person explicitly telling them, right? So that means that they don't actually need external supervision. So that actually leads to the last advantage of interactive perception, which is enabling new opportunities for self-supervised learning. So as you probably know, training any machine learning model actually requires a lot of data, and oftentimes the most expensive part of this data is obtained annotation. So for example, labeling images as cat. However, in this framework of interactive perception, the system now is able to automatically collect and label its own training data. And actually, in most of the projects I talked about today, already using this idea. Right? So for example, in the dense FizzNet project, we asked the system to predict what the object gonna move after different interactions. And then the system actually can observe the object's motion by itself using camera and use that as a supervision signal. So people don't need to actually annotate those training data. And similarly, in tossing bots, actually, after each of the tossing action, the robot is able to observe and track the landing locations of the object by using a top-down camera, and use that as a supervision signal to train the robot, the whole system. And actually, once the robot is finished tossing out the object, it actually resets the experiment so that it actually can continue its training overnight, and we don't actually need to provide any supervision throughout the whole process. So to summarize, I think in today's talk, I try to highlight the 3 advantages of interactive perception that is kind of helping us to get additional observations of the environment, help the system to discover physical properties beyond its visual appearance. And finally, I think it's also most important thing is that it gives us a new opportunity to develop self-supervised learning system without human annotation. And I think ultimately our hope is that with this kind of framework of interactive perception, we can change the role of computer vision from a passive observer that just sit there and looking at the images to an active explorer that kind of constantly engage with the environment in order to continuously improve their understanding about the world. And that's the end of my talk. And thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to join the discussion. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I'm going to invite Rudy to join us up here so we can get into the Q&A portion of the discussion today. So I'm going to get the discussion started with just something that I can't help but ask. And then we'll maybe solicit more questions from the audience, because discussion is always better when we can all participate. In both your talks, you were really getting at this idea that what perceptual information an organism uses is shaped by its behavioral goals. And especially with your idea of going from passive observation to active perception through tactile input, I couldn't help but think about multisensory integration. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about how an organism integrates information across audition, tactile input, smelling things to produce consistent behavior, and how it navigates its environment.
Should I start? Yeah, no, I think it's a really fascinating question. A lot of sensory perception work has focused on kind of unisensory experimentation. We try to understand vision or another lab will try to understand olfaction, but very clearly our experience of the world is not unisensory, it's absolutely multisensory. And I think, at least in my lab, we're really trying to integrate different modalities to be able to really understand different senses, not in isolation, but in the way that they interact, because that's really kind of the power of the brain, right? So in my lab, we study also learning, and we're trying to understand how having more than one stream of information can actually help you learn better. Same with the navigation, even within one sensory modality, if you can see intensity, color, polarization, maybe that's the way to actually build a good cognitive map of the sky, say, and not just with one of these different things. So I think definitely multisensory integration is kind of critical in our understanding of perception.
Yeah, definitely agree. I think that's a very good question. I think in the research field and also in robotics, for example, we have a very strong focus on vision. And I think that's kind of heavily influenced how we humans perceive the world. Yeah, there's a joke in computer vision saying that if there is a group of dog researchers kind of gathering around, they will not study computer vision, they will study computational smell. Because for them, smell is more important, or equally important as their vision, right? So I think we kind of bias our research kind of based on the understanding of how we function in this environment. But I think in the robotics field, it's very easy to see that they can benefit from multimodalities, or multisensory inputs. So just an example that we kind of see recently is we kind of deal kind of handling a lot about like deformable objects like multiplication class that you see the examples, and then vision actually is quite limited in those kind of applications because they have self-occlusions. When you have class kind of folded and crumpled together, you don't see much. But the tactile information is very important. Like for example, imagine how you actually pick up one layer of class, right? From vision, you cannot do that. Most of this actually depends on tactile information in order to do that action. So I think there's a lot of examples that we can point out that if we are more open on like introducing different type of sensor modalities, we can build a more robust system, just even in the robotic setup, yeah.
Thank you so much for entertaining that question. Even in this discussion about vision, I think it's important to think about what else is out there. And as you pointed out, even vision is granular. Like you can break it down into color, edges, motion, as you studied in your postdoc. I'm going to take this question from someone in the virtual audience who's a 9th grader, from Ashley, who's asking how the computer brain compares with the human brain when designing these robots to see and to learn about its environment. Are you necessarily trying to mimic characteristics of a human brain? I think it's a very deep question.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, I get this question quite a lot. So I think when people like introducing neural network, oftentimes, like sometimes, like I think a few years ago, people like to say that it's like heavily inspired by brain. But I would say that yes, it is inspired by brain, but we can see there's a lot of difference. Like it's so I think there's two views of how we should build robots or how to build artificial intelligence. One view is kind of like we just want to build something useful, and we don't really need to necessarily mimic human behavior or human intelligence. And there's another view that, and I think that's also because like fundamentally, like computers, like CPUs, just functional very different compared to like human brain. And it's not necessarily we need to take the same path, for example. And I think another view is that by understanding human brain or understanding how human works or like animals works and try to mimic that can give us a shortcut because that's a working system, right? So we don't need to kind of imagining something from scratch. We can kind of like build something based on something we already understand, right? So I totally see both view, and yeah, I can see like both paths will give us like step forward, yeah.
Yeah, this is definitely a question about robots, but to kind of make it more relevant to color vision, I couldn't help but think about illusions of color that fool a human, even if you know what's going on. Like you see the image, but the same illusion exists. Like, have you thought about treating fruit flies to, visual illusions? And
people do that. We have not done this in the lab, but they definitely, because the underlying mechanisms are similar or convergent, there are some optical illusions that we are fooled by that flies are also fooled by. And I think these optical illusions are really interesting because they tell us about the inner workings of the brain, right? But going back to what you were saying, I think there's the issue that, the constraints on our brains and on our neural circuits are very different from the constraints that you have in a computer. So it's not necessarily the same solution that's going to solve the same problem. But it's true, it seems, I mean, there are people that make like bio-mimicked robots, and I think there are probably some tricks that you can use maybe from
can be inspired
flies.
from,
Flies do so many things with so few cells, right? They're super efficient. So how can we maybe be inspired by flies that are so efficient to make very efficient robots?
Or compute, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so one of the things that flies do is that they multiplex a lot. So they use the same circuit to do many different things. And they have to do that because they have a very small brain. Maybe it'd be interesting if there was a way to kind of bridge that when you think about a robot or computer vision that can do multiple things with, less processing power.
Exactly. I also feel like I thought of this question a little bit more, and my brain started to come up with all these examples of robot mechanism, like hardware that builds kind of inspired by animals. And I think it's relatively easy because we can observe their mechanisms and we can kind of try to mimic their hardware. But it always takes more time to really understand how their brain function, how their cognition function. So that's maybe why we cannot really build like a machine that's exactly mimicking like how we think or how our brain work. But if we can figure that out, I think that's definitely like very useful as well. Yeah.
Thanks for your responses. I'd love to take some questions from the live audience if there are any. Individual in the front. A microphone is coming your way. Thank you.
Hi, I have a question about how is color vision different from motion vision? Is it different brain process? Is it different structure in the eye? Because I don't know. Is it different?
I mean, it's different circuits that process this information.
So it's in the brain. It's inside.
Yeah. So all everything that you see, our eyes don't work like cameras, right? I think when it comes to motion vision, you think, like a ball moves from left to right. It just seems like it makes more sense maybe than the color purple, right? But it's always a reconstruction. Like we never see everything. So say sometimes if a ball goes too fast, you're not gonna see it. So you're always reconstructing the world. So it's the same principle. It's just different circuit that extract different types of information. So in this case, it's how luminance changes happen one next to each other in a temporal manner, right? So this is how the brain actually sees motion, is to compare in different points in space instead of comparing different discrete wavelengths of light, say. But I think the fundamental principles might be different, but it's always the same idea of the brain constructing everything that we see. Does that answer your question?
Yes. So it's more like we have some information and our brain making an inference of what exactly is going on. And it feels so complicated in a brain, but we have this motion detector cameras, the one that gives you tickets when you like do red color, and they seem so simple, but it's so complicated, like in our brain.
I mean, it depends what you mean by complicated. I think so. I worked in motion vision during my postdoc, and what the circuit does, I could explain it just with a few words. They're neurons that look at different points in space, and then there's a neuron downstream that basically compares when something lights up here or here, and this is kind of apparent motion. It's actually the kind of the underlying principles are not complicated. It's just trying to figure out how the brain does it is maybe what's more complicated. Yes.
Thank you.
And I want to follow up on that. I feel that's a very good example that actually computer vision take inspirations from like animal sense motion. For example, the motion capturing like cameras that the way that computer vision work is that they just detect the change of pixels. And then one benefit of detecting motion is that they don't need to store all the data. And then so that they only need to detect when something moves and only store the data when something moves. And I think that is a good example of inspired by like animals and biologists. Yeah.
I think that's a very informative point, because the goal for a computer vision algorithm is decided by the researcher. And when it comes to detecting motion in the organic world, it's navigation, which is a lot more challenging cognitively. Like, it's also relative motion between, people moving in a scene versus a bus in the background versus the sun moving in the sky. So in our visual world, motion just operates at so many levels that the complexity really comes from there. Any other questions from the live audience? There's one in the back.
So I had a separate question, but I had a question that conversation made me think of. Dreams and colors. Does it follow the same pathway? Like, how does that work compared to like what we visually actually see? And then just for fun, like, at what point of neuronal complexity can something dream? Do we know? Like, can a fly dream? In the dream world, can a robot perceivably dream?
This is your question.
So can flies dream? I don't know. I think, so I don't know very much about dreams. I think people do study kind of the parts of the brain that are activated in dreams. And I would have to look this up again, but I do think that the same parts of the brain that are activated, say, even when you imagine something, as when you see it, they're the same, right? It's just, it's not, I actually don't know much about this, but I suppose that probably these hue cells, to give us this perception, we still have this perception of color, whether we're dreaming it, imagining it, or remembering, or actually seeing. Maybe different pathways activate the same cells. That would be my assumption, but I think it's a really nice and interesting question.
Actually, I know nothing as well, but I have a hypothesis. Like, I think this is a good example actually to show that vision, or like the color, is constructs of brain, right? Because that's like when you're dreaming, absolutely you're not sensing, right? Your eyes closed, but you can still see, and then that feeling of seeing is basically constructed by brain. Yeah.
It's a science fiction question. It's making me think of, do androids dream of electric sheep? There's a lovely question from the online audience that I'm going to direct to you right now. It's just like about flexibility of the visual system. This is from Gordon Silverman, and they're asking, can you explain or share how you understand how the same system works in a variety of different environments? For example, for someone or like something that lives at the bottom of the ocean that doesn't receive a lot of light but is from the same species, how does the visual system work in that environment?
So there's a lot of adaptation. I think that's kind of the key word. And there's adaptation that happens at the single cell level. There's adaptation that happens at the circuit level. There's also a lot of neuromodulation. There's kind of the example for vision, the example of attention. So you can be attentive to something, and you're going to actually see it. But there's times in the day where actually I'm like daydreaming and I almost don't see anything, even though the light is coming into my eyes, right? So all of this kind of flexibility comes from both how neurons process information at a single level, but also in terms of how state dependence, environmental changes, and behavioral states can actually modify how a circuit works. And this is kind of what I was getting at when I talked about multiplexing. Like the same circuit can act and do what it's supposed to do in many different, say, light levels, or when a fly or a mouse is, for example, walking, we know that the visual system increases its gain. so it's just, there's a lot going on. It's not the static view of things, and it's hard to explain when you're trying to explain like perception. But it really, it's it's another example of the fact that it's such a construct, because the same stimulus can be perceived very differently in different states. So I hope that's getting to the question.
I think it's exactly what the person wanted to hear.
Okay.
Yeah, and then I think that's a good point, because that also makes the adaptation is also the biggest difference compared to like animal and humans perception compared to robots, right? We are trying so hard to make robot adaptable, but they are still not. So like, I show you so many robots that they are really good at doing one thing, right? They are very good at tossing objects, but they are not like they cannot do like other things. And then I think that is really like getting to the like the ability that's to adapt and also kind of use the same circuit for different tasks. I think that's something that our robots still kind of lacking today.
Maybe it's a good time for another question from the live audience, if there are any. Up in the front over here.
I'm coming.
Great, thanks a lot. So I guess the question is, like with the robot case, is the representation that the robot relies on, is that interpretable to us? Like, is that understandable? So we know it gets sensory input and we know it makes behavior, but like what happens in between?
Yeah.
And then I guess applying it to flies, sort of, is it because the like neuronal complexity is so much simpler than humans, for instance, that we have that understandability that we wouldn't otherwise have?
Yeah, I can answer the question first. So it really depends on the system. So the question, if I repeat, is whether the learned visual representation is interpretable in a robot system. It really depends on how you build the robot system. I think in the classical way of building robots, it's extremely interpretable, right? Because we kind of hand code that you want to detect objects and then model the object pose and geometry and then do the planning on top of that. But today, I think we are moving more towards like this kind of end-to-end learning, that you just kind of drive the perception based on the action. Right? So for example, the tossing ball case, we just learned, the system just needs to learn how to toss different objects. And in the end, we can kind of try to visualize the features in order to try to understand whether the model learns some different mass distributions or aerodynamics, but it's no longer that explicit, right? I think when we are moving towards more and more end-to-end learning, it will become harder and harder to really understand what they learned. Yeah, so yeah, that's my answer, yeah.
So I think in terms of flies, I think this is why I work with flies. I think I would have a very hard time myself working on a human brain or on a primate brain. I think it's hard to interpret. And with flies, we have this kind of beautiful level of complex enough, but not too complex to actually be able to extract meaning that is not just kind of a black box. Not that we should, my pitch is that we should work on every animal, and it's and I stick with that, but I think you just learn different things. And with flies, you can really learn kind of mechanistically kind of what computations are happening that can achieve this level of kind of perception. And I think it's really nice to be able to see this in action.
Sure, we'll take another question from the live audience.
Hi, I'm awesome lecture, by the way.
Thank you.
I do have a question. I'm very much into like sci-fi and The Simpsons and everything. They have episodes about everything and have definitely proven that they could see into the future. So there was one where it was a Treehouse of Horror episode, and the dolphins came up out of the ocean and started to like attack the humans and take over, the land. I'm very serious. And I've also watched Terminator plenty of times. Do you guys see or is there like a real fear for like an adaptation or evolution in like perception as like humans ever being the enemy towards like robots or animals? Like fruit flies are invading my home like crazy.
That's your word.
They're very successful.
And my iRobot, the thing that cleans your floors, Roomba, Yeah, I'm about to throw it like off the roof because it is just destroying my home. So I don't know. Do you think there's like a way that they would ever,
Yeah, so yeah, maybe let me answer that question. I kind of get similar type of question, not that scary, but like similar type of question. And I think most of the time people ask from the aspect that I work on robotics, do we need to worry about robot replacing humans and replacing labors, right? Do we need to be fearful about robots become more and more capable? My answer, or at least my general feeling, is that fear will not take us anywhere, right? I think really to try to understand the technology or making more people understand the technology and then treating them as a tool and use them well is the key. So I think when people don't really understand something, they're more likely to fear them. But once you understand them and then you can use them to help you, then it's a more productive way of thinking about technology. Yeah, so that's my short answer for your question. Hopefully answer your question. Hopefully make you can sleep at night. Sorry.
No, nothing. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that really brings together what you were saying about end-to-end learning and explainability of features and the need to understand technology. Like as algorithms get more and more sophisticated, we need to understand what they're prioritizing in their ability to learn about the world better. And
exactly, yeah.
it's worth the investment of effort and yeah. I'm going to move on to a question from the online audience. It's a really interesting one about scale and costs of vision. So the question is if you can comment more on the storage or compression of visual data coming into animal, human brains or computers, because so much of successful sensing and knowing and perceiving what to filter out comes from deciding what is noise and what is important signal. Really cool question from Laura Keaton.
That's definitely what the brain does. I mean, if we were to process all visual information, all sensory information, I think it would just never work. We would never be where we are. And I think understanding how the brain does that is really critical. Being able to know how they filter things out, how the brain filters some of this information out. And it goes back a bit to what I mentioned about different species, right? Each species has a certain finite amount of memory or finite amount of hardware that can process information. The key is knowing, what to process and what not to process. Flies, for example, like 70% of their brain is dedicated to vision. So they're extremely visual animals, right? There's other animals that are more olfactory or other, but there's always a trade-off. And again, when you think about different states, when you're sleeping, when you're hungry, when you're looking for food, that it needs to always, that's what the brain does. There's always a choice being made about what to process and what not to process and what to use and not to use. And I think understanding how that works, I think is really fascinating.
Yeah, I think in robotics in the field, we will definitely benefit from knowing how the brain works, because that is another examples of the difference. So right now, computer vision, we often we know that for human vision, we kind of attend on different area of the image based on our task. But I think most of the computer vision algorithms are designed kind of processing all the pixels at the same time, right? So I think that is a big difference. And also I feel like that's partially kind of motivates this kind of action-driven perception. Is that using your robot's action or using your robot's task in order to learn the right perception representation is in the hope that if you design the system to learn directly for the end task, the system cannot learn this right compression algorithm that's kind of only focus on which part matters, right? So a simple example I can think about is when we asked the robot to learn how to grasp different objects, they actually didn't really know, didn't need to know recognizing different objects. It just need to understand the 3D geometry of the objects, right? So in that case, it can filter out a lot of unnecessary information. But then if you need a system to do a different task, you need to learn a different representation. So that's the part that it cannot adapt. Yeah.
was in watching the videos about grasping the cloth and like picking it up. Is there a risk of like going for someone who might be like wearing something, or like a scarf or a piece of cloth that's already hanging? Like, how do you give input about restricting the search space for the robot to explore?
Yeah. I think we didn't really think about this unstructured setting. We kind of just thinking about the robot doing laundry and the cloth is already on the floor or in the basket. So in that scenario, grasping a cloth is actually really easy. As long as it's anywhere on the cloth, you can pick it up. And because cloth is kind of soft, so you actually don't need to have very careful planning on how to grasp it. But obviously, if you need a robot at home, then you kind of need to dealing with like the person at home, also the animals at home. Like there's a lot more complexities that we cannot handle right now. Yeah.
Thanks for entertaining that aside. I think that there's another question in the back, and there's time for maybe just one more.
Thank you so much for this talk tonight. And you've already alluded a lot to the limitations and where we're at right now. I'm curious, where do you hope that robotics will go in the future? Where do you hope understanding of brains will go in the future, not just robotics?
Yeah, so maybe let me start. I think what I really hope, well, like I think this is always my hope, is I hope we have a robot at home that can help me do my laundries or like similar things. But I also know how far it is. So I think like I will have my job security for very long. Like it's gonna take a while to figure out. Yeah, so that's my hope. Yeah.
I mean, the brain, I guess there's so many things that we still don't understand. I just can't pick and choose. But I think, kind of, again, integrating our knowledge across species, I think is very important. Integrating on the knowledge across time scales as well of life, I think is also important. And yeah, just learning more and more about the brain and kind of in a very fundamental way without a particular goal in mind, I think is also very valuable. So I'd like to see a lot more of that.
We might have time for another question from the live audience if there is one. There we go, up in the front. Sorry, you can just wait for the microphone 1 second so everyone can hear us.
Hi, I'm interested in how like the number of cones corresponds to, or number of types of cones corresponds to like complexity of perception of color. Like if you have more cones within one color range, how does that correspond to the animal's experience?
So it kind of boils down again to what happens downstream of it, right? So there's this famous example of mantis shrimp that have like 12 different types of cones. From experimental behavioral experiments, they don't seem to have very fine-grained vision at all, color vision at all, because they seem to not do this color opponency. So they don't compare between channels. Each one of these channels kind of acts independently to drive specific behavior. So just looking at an animal's assortment of photoreceptor types is not going to tell you, how fine-grained things are. But if you know that they do compare, it's actually very useful to have a lot of overlap. So we have a lot of overlap between our green and our red cones. And it's really in that space that we see more, that we can discriminate the best. So you can predict knowing what kind of processing happens downstream. But it really, again, it's one of those really marvelous examples of how it really is all a construct, and that just having the hardware in the eye is not going to do anything for you except for like maybe driving specific behaviors. And so we can't predict, like even flies, the work that we're doing is really completely agnostic. I mean, we don't know what they see. Every time we do a recording, every time we learn more about a neuron, we know more about how they actually perceive the world. But we can have knowledge of it before we look into their brain, basically.
I think to wrap up the discussion, maybe I'll bring us back to sort of something that both of you have already spoken to. You were talking about how we would study smells if dogs were scientists. And we were also discussing this idea of like constructing as an act of perception. So I was just wondering your thoughts about vision as a dominant modality for the species that we study, like humans for me and fruit flies for Rudy, right? How much that shapes how we understand neuronal computation, and whether we need to be doing something more in our improving our understanding of the brain in moving beyond vision. Like, are we sort of doing the self-fulfilling prophecy of we are visual animals, so we study vision, but then we understand neuronal computation in vision better than any other modality. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
I think there's a few aspects here that come to my mind. One of the reasons also that I think there's a lot of vision study is that it's very easy to control light. It's not so easy to control an odor. It's also pretty easy to control sound, I guess. And these kind of technical aspects do drive science one way or another, right? The other aspect of this is that, you know, the fundamental principles of perception are actually not that different as we find when you compare one sensory modality to the other. Like there's intensity invariance is probably done in similar ways when it comes to the kind of smell or sound or light. So I think studying one sense doesn't mean that you're not learning in general about what how perception works. And as we talked about, I think this like multisensory studies are really, really important.
Yeah, I think we all agree that studying multisensory is very important. And I guess I want to bring out another like maybe limitations of like if we only think about one type of sensor is, so the reason why robots use a color camera, most of the robots use color camera as a primary sensor. Another reason is because color camera is actually really cheap. And it's not because it's cheap to build, it's just because it's massively produced. Because phones need a camera, there are so many like use of camera. So that's why it becomes so easy to produce and standardize, and it's so good. So I think there is like a certain loop that's going on. Like we study vision a lot, therefore use vision sensor a lot. So I think there is definitely benefits of reaching out to other modalities as well, just for the diversity of it. And another thing I think I want to say is that indeed, at least in machine learning field, one thing that we found very surprising is that for different modalities, if you find out one neural network, like neural network architecture works well, for example, for vision, oftentimes after a few months or like, yeah, typically it's months, you'll realize that it also works well for example, language and sound. So I think that kind of maybe showing something that there are some similarities between different modalities. So maybe it's not too bad that we focus on vision. Yeah, so that's just my thoughts, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for such insightful and thoughtful responses. And it's just like making me so excited about the research that you're going to continue doing. I'll keep my eyes out, and I think I'm convinced that maybe we should study color vision in fruit flies because you can map out the whole brain, like the connectome is there, you know. So it's really, I learned a lot from this talk. Before we break, I want to thank the audience for being here and for your really interesting, speculative, wonderful, curious thoughts. And I want to invite you to this event that a colleague told me about. It's an online and in-person event that's hosted by the Royal Society. If this topic interested you, it's called New Approaches to 3D Vision, and it takes place in this building in person and also online on Feb 15th at 4:30 p.m. And with that, I'm going to thank the speakers again and pass it back to Diana. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, I have a few closing thoughts, and they're written on a piece of paper. Let me use my eyes to read. Okay, that was my connection. So thank you. Thank you to our fabulous speakers and moderator, to Rudy, to Shuran, and to Vasiki. And thank you for all of you in our audience for giving us the materials for a great conversation. I look forward to one day when a robot will do my laundry and then put together an outfit for me based on its color perception. Not only that, but all of these, I think we're really poised for some great breakthroughs that you're all discussing. It's really inspirational. So I also wanted to flag for our online attendees that there's a survey in the chat. We love to hear your thoughts about this lecture series. And if you enjoyed tonight's program, in this style of lecture series, we have one more coming up in April. It'll be on the 20th of April, that is a Thursday, same time, same place, and it'll be all about how we learn to learn. And our speakers will be Dr. Jacqueline Gottlieb, Dr. Elisa Sun, and our moderator will be Dr. Jennifer Bossel, and they will be talking about attention, failure, and confidence in learning. So in the meantime, I hope you stay healthy and be well, and I